Hi everyone, my name is Steve Macek. I'm a professor of communication here at North Central College. Most of my teaching is in the area of media studies. I teach courses on media history that cover how the media affect society, culture, and politics. I also, from time to time, teach courses on the First Amendment, and I've also done a fair amount of research and writing about media policy issues, that is, the way that government policy affects media institutions or media businesses. Today, I want to talk to you about how the coronavirus and the economic downturn that's followed from the coronavirus pandemic threaten local journalism and what, if anything, we might do about it. So, as I said, today I'm going to talk to you about, first of all, what's happening to journalism as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, especially what's happening to local journalism. I want to briefly touch on what is causing this crisis, why it is that news organizations have been especially susceptible or especially endangered by the economic downturn caused by the pandemic. I want to talk about why this matters, why anyone should care that local journalism and local news outlets might be threatened as a result of the pandemic. And then, like I said, I'm going to turn to what, if anything, we can do to save local journalism. Craig Silverman of BuzzFeed News has written that the coronavirus is a media extinction event. And I believe, in fact, it is, and in fact, that might actually be an understatement. Many of you may remember the economic crisis, the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, and many of you may be aware of how that crisis affected journalism. During the 2008-2009 financial crisis, at least 120 newspapers around the country shut their doors. More than 26,000 journalists lost their job. The newspaper industry in particular suffered a 19% decline in revenues, although local TV stations, which are a major source of broadcast news, also suffered revenue declines. And probably most importantly, and what many of you may remember, is that during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, both of Chicago's main newspapers, daily newspapers, the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times, entered into bankruptcy. And there was talk for a time of the possibility that Chicago, right, a city of, a metropolitan area of more than 3 million people, may be without a major daily newspaper. Because during the crisis, not only did the Trib and the Sun-Times declare bankruptcy, they laid off reporters in droves, they sold off a lot of real estate and other assets, and some of you may know that the Chicago Tribune sold the Chicago Tribune Tower, that iconic building on the Chicago skyline, which is now being converted into condos. And both papers went through sort of ownership disruptions or changes and restructuring. And in the case of the Chicago Sun-Times, I think it went through 2 or 3 ownership changes in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So that crisis was bad, and it was really, really bad for newspapers and news organizations. Well, the fact is, this crisis, the crisis brought on by the pandemic, is even worse. And I just want to briefly touch on what's happened to the news industry in Chicago since the pandemic hit in March. So to begin with, the Chicago Tribune implemented 10% pay cuts for all non-unionized employees making more than $67,000 per year. It implemented 3-week furloughs for all unionized employees making more than $40,000 a year. Executives at the paper took permanent pay cuts of up to 10%. The Daily Herald, right, our suburban daily with offices not very far from North Central, reduced salaries of staff members, of all staff members, by 15%, and officers at the parent company, Paddock Publications, took a 20% pay cut. The alternative weekly, Chicago Reader, which is one of my favorite publications since I used to write for alternative weeklies, reduced its publication schedule to once every 2 weeks from once a week, citing a 90% drop in ad revenues. Let that sink in. 90% drop in ad revenues. And for a free newspaper like the Chicago Reader, ad revenues are their main source of revenue. So they suffered a 90% decline in revenues as a result of the economic downturn. WBEZ, Chicago Public Media, also maybe known to many of you as Chicago Public Radio, cut 12 employees, although thankfully no reporters were cut. It reduced employee benefits and it cut executive compensation. CBS TV, WBBM Channel 2 cut at least a dozen employees, including, most shockingly, Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter Pam Zeckman, who is a Chicago institution. She's, I think, 75 years old. She's been working in Chicago newsrooms, whether it was the Sun-Times or the Tribune, or more recently in CBS, for decades, and she lost her job. NBC's WMAQ Channel 5 and the NBC-owned Telemundo affiliate WSNS Channel 44 suffered staff cuts and pay reductions. WTTW, the PBS affiliate in town, WTTW Channel 11, as well as WFMT, which is also owned by WTTW's parent company, laid off 4 employees and reduced hours for 7 other staffers. Cumulus Media, which owns several Chicago radio stations, including WLS and WKQX 101.1, put employees on 90-day furloughs and implemented 90-day pay cuts for others. iHeartMedia Chicago, which is part of the huge national iHeartMedia radio chain, operates several radio stations in Chicago, and it put more than 30 employees on temporary unpaid leave. And even the highest rated news station in Chicago, WBBM 780 AM, has had layoffs. They parted ways with 2 valued members of the sports team, the sports news team, George Offman and Chris Habermill. So it has been a kind of an utter devastation. And even worse, the downturn has opened the door for vulture capitalists to possibly seize control of Chicago's highest circulation newspaper, the Tribune. Alden Global Capital, which is a hedge fund known for taking over newspapers, putting them into its newspaper chain, Media News Group, and then just bleeding them dry of resources, laying off staff, selling off parts of the paper, selling off assets, has been quietly purchasing stock in the Tribune's parent company, Tribune Publishing Co. And as of June 30th, they had enough stock under their control to force the company to give Alden 2 seats on the 7-member board. Now, a Tribune Publishing Company agreement with Alden prevents the hedge fund from making a hostile takeover bid until the 2021 board meeting. So it has, this agreement sort of buys the paper some time before Alden takes over completely, but many observers feel that this may be just delaying the inevitable. And employees at the Tribune Publishing Company papers, not just the Chicago Tribune, but papers around the country in Connecticut and Virginia and elsewhere, are organizing to resist what they see as a potentially catastrophic takeover of their papers by Alden. So the downturn has weakened, even an eminent paper and a high circulation paper like the Tribune to the point where it can be taken over by a hedge fund. Amazingly, as bad as things are here in Chicago, things are even worse in other places around the country. Take, for example, Madison, Wisconsin, where I was a college student. I went to the University of Wisconsin. Madison. In Madison, Wisconsin, the Wisconsin State Journal and the Capital Times, the two main newspapers serving the Wisconsin capital, implemented sweeping pay cuts and furloughs. And meanwhile, the city's venerable alternative weekly, the Isthmus, which was, when I was a college student, required reading. I knew many people who wrote for that paper, announced that it would go dark until economic conditions improved. So it ceased publication for the time being until economic conditions improve. In Cleveland, things are even worse. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, which employed some 340 journalists just 20 years ago in the year 2000, has had its newsroom absolutely decimated. The owners have cut the staff to just four full-time employees. That's 4 employees for the flagship newspaper of a city of 380,000 people. It's absolutely shocking. Meanwhile, newspaper chains like McClatchy, which actually declared bankruptcy, earlier this year, Gannett, the parent company of USA Today, and Alden's News Group, Media News Group, have implemented layoffs, furloughs, and pay cuts. Overall, the picture is very, very bleak. And the fact is that even before the crisis hit, newsroom employment was dwindling. Even after the cuts, right, that took place in 2008 and 2009, there were severe declines in the newsroom staffs. So you can see from these graphs, and they're both from the Pew Research Center, between 2008 and 2019, overall newsroom employment declined by 23%. Newsroom employment at U.S. newspapers dropped by an astounding 51%. That means that half of all newspaper employees were laid off between 2008 and 2019. So already newspapers were making do with, and news organizations were making do with dramatically reduced staffs. But the pandemic induced economic downturn has devastated the ranks of the nation's reporters. So this is a graph from a report by Challenger, Gray, and Christmas, which is a research firm, did some research on cuts to newsroom employment. And what they found is in 2020, already just from January through June, 11,027 reporters have been fired from newsrooms around the country, which is almost as much as almost as many reporters as were fired in the year 2009 at the height, in the depths of the financial crisis. And so that's over 6 months, and we still have 6 months to go. And if the trend keeps up, this will certainly be the highest number of newsroom cuts ever recorded. As long as people have been keeping track of this sort of thing. In the space of just 5 months, more than 50 local newsrooms, most of them at weeklies serving smaller cities and rural areas, have closed nationwide. All told, according to a New York Times estimate, some 36,000 reporters have been laid off, furloughed, or endured pay cuts since the beginning of the pandemic. And we're only halfway through the year. So what is causing this crisis? Why has the economic downturn caused by the pandemic wreaked such havoc on the news industry? The the short answer is declining revenues and declining audiences. I think there are several different reasons why the current crisis has been especially hard on the news industry. If I had more time, I could go into those reasons in a lot greater depth. But I think that the main reasons are that, first of all, the commercial news media has been losing audiences and paying customers for years, really for decades, and so was already in a very weakened state. And second, that the economic downturn has led to a steep decline in advertising spending, which has deprived news outlets of their main source of revenues. This chart, I think, really says it all. It sums up the problem facing the news industry and especially the newspaper industry. This is a chart of paid circulation of daily newspapers in the US from 1985 to 2018. And you can see here that it has, and this is in, in thousands. So you can see that this is, the paid circulation of U.S. newspapers has just plummeted to less than half what it was back in the 1980s. But the other reason really is declining ad revenues. And most newspapers, most broadcast news outlets are commercial, and they depend on advertising sponsorship to underwrite the costs of gathering and disseminating the news. And back during the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, the news industry faced a 6.4% decline in ad spending, and I've already talked about how horrible those years were for the news industry and how it resulted in all sorts of cuts and closures. Well, fast forward to today, and you can see that the decline in ad spending has been even more dramatic. There was a 9.1% decline in ad spending in 2020, fiscal year 2020. Now the projections are that will dramatically recover, but I think those projections assume a lot about the economic recovery, and I think that the economic recovery is in serious doubt. And this is another graph showing the really dramatic decline in ad spending by medium. And you can see that, there were, newspapers were already projected to face like a 5.9% decline in revenues even before the crisis. But since the crisis, it's been a 19.5% decline. Magazines have had declines in ad revenue. So has radio, so has television. All of this has had an impact on news organizations, which absolutely depend on advertising revenue. Well, one response to this information I presented so far might be to say, well, so what? What does it matter whether news organizations disappear, whether staffs for broadcast news outlets are cut, newspapers close, and reporting and the number of reporters continues to dwindle? Why does it matter? I think it matters enormously for the health of our society, and especially for the health of our of our political system. The news media is our main source of information about matters of public concern. We count on the news to perform a watchdog function in our society. We count on them to monitor the actions of powerful elites and powerful institutions, and we count on them to hold those individuals and institutions accountable for abuses of power by exposing them, right, to public scrutiny. We also count on the news media to function in a way as an early warning system, alerting us to social, political, ecological, economic trends that might become problems in the future, that might demand a public or governmental response. They're the ones who warn us about, right, the dangers facing the world, facing society due to climate change, or the dangers posed by mass incarceration, the trend towards mass incarceration of people of color, et cetera, et cetera. And moreover, not only do the media function as a watchdog and as an early warning system, but in contemporary American society, they also are our public sphere. They are the cultural space where we gather and interact as citizens, where we get together to debate and discuss matters of common concern. And without common general interest intermediaries like daily newspapers, which have, the letters to the editor section, or broadcast news shows that invite on representatives of the community to debate and discuss important issues facing the community, it's difficult for us as a society to have discussions capable of generating consensus, right? Or even just mutual understanding. So, the fact that the economic downturn is threatening the media and threatening these three functions of the media, its watchdog function, its early warning system function, and public sphere function, should be of huge concern to us. But especially concerning to us should be the fact that newspapers are threatened. Because newspapers, particularly local newspapers, are especially important as a source of civic information. And they are the outlets suffering the most in this crisis. According to a 2019 Neiman Labs study, local newspapers constituted only 25% of the total news outlets, but produced 60% of the locally focused news produced in a sample of news ecosystems in 100 different communities. So local newspapers produced much more locally focused news than TV, radio, and online outlets combined. Older studies have demonstrated that as newspapers have cut staff and laid off reporters, the amount and frequency of coverage of entire categories of stories have declined. For instance, over the past 20 years, there has been a dramatic decline in coverage of labor issues, state-level politics, municipal politics, and certain types of international news. And increasingly, in one community after another, school boards, city council meetings, and courts are conducting business in the public's name without reporters being present to regularly document their actions. The fact is, without well-funded, appropriately staffed news organizations reporting on our communities, the American public will become less informed about the world, political corruption will flourish unchecked, and news deserts, areas without regular sources of civic information, will expand. So what is to be done? How do we save local journalism so that it can perform these important functions for our society? Well, there are lots of ideas out there. The simplest, I think, response is to pay for the media you consume. In this internet age, many of us are used to reading newspaper stories and magazine stories and news reports without actually paying for them. We expect to get that kind of content for free, even though it requires professional reporters, professional journalists going out, combing through public documents, interviewing people, interviewing politicians and public officials and others, and piecing together the facts into a digestible story. It requires somebody who gets paid to do that. We're used to getting all of that content. We're used to getting newspaper, magazine, and other stories for free, thanks to the internet. And so one thing you can do to respond to this crisis of local journalism is to pay for the media you consume to some extent. or another, right? Subscribe to newspapers, magazines, and news sites that you use. Donate to public and community TV and radio stations that you listen to or watch. It is now possible, thanks to Patreon and Substack, for people to support individual reporters by subscribing to their content and paying a sort of nominal monthly fee for access to that content. So the first thing you can do is pay for the content, the media you consume. Okay, I had to move the little video window over to the other side of the screen for a second. In addition to supporting local journalism by paying for the news that you consume, I think there are other ways that we, as individuals, can respond to the crisis of local journalism. And one is to support the efforts of a group like the NewsGuildCWA, which is a labor union that represents employees of newspapers, in their fight for better local media ownership. On June 30th, a group of News Guild reporters at 10 Tribune Publication Company publications launched a coalition to resist what they fear will be an Alden Global Capital takeover and gutting of their papers. The group is, quote, seeking local investors who recognize that local newspapers are a vital community resource. They're also circulating a petition seeking community support, and here is a screen grab of that petition. And you can learn more about the campaign, about the issues facing the Tribune Publication Company employees, and about what you can do to help by going to www.saveourtribune.org. But obviously, the crisis facing local journalism is so vast, and is affecting so many reporters, so many news outlets, that the kind of responses I've talked about so far, the individual responses, paying for the news you consume, supporting labor unions' fight for better local media ownership, are only going to go so far. A bigger, more systematic response is required, really, to address the full extent of this crisis. One thing that people are discussing, and is being discussed in media policy circles and media industry circles, is perhaps expanding nonprofit ownership of local media outlets. Another thing that people are talking about is charitable foundations doing more to promote local journalism. For example, issuing grants or subsidizing local reporters so that they can cover important local stories. And there is some precedent for this. There are some models that we can look to that are out there already. So in 2016, Philadelphia businessman Jerry Lenfest purchased and then donated the Philadelphia Media Network, which is the parent company was at the time the parent company of the Philadelphia Inquirer, to the Philadelphia Foundation. The paper and its other media properties were then converted to a nonprofit public benefit corporation, and something like this could be the model for other news organizations in financial distress. In November 2019, the IRS agreed to allow the Salt Lake City Tribune to be transformed into a nonprofit with the consent and support of its main owner. Moreover, it has already become increasingly common for charitable foundations to underwrite or subsidize the work of reporters at commercial news outlets. So, for instance, the the community trust recently gave the Chicago Sun-Times a grant to hire and fund the work of 2 reporters, Elvia Malagon, formerly of the Chicago Tribune, who will report on economic inequality, and Brett Chase, an investigative reporter who used to work for the Better Business Association, who will now be reporting for the Sun-Times on public health and the environment. And this is being paid for by a grant from the community trust. And both of these strategies, taking financially distressed papers and converting them to nonprofits, and community and charitable foundations contributing money directly to subsidize and underwrite local reporting, I think are very promising. But the situation is so bad that something even more dramatic, I think, is called for. And that's a generous government bailout for journalism, since it does perform a vital function for our society, and we really cannot function, especially function politically, without a vibrant media, news media. I believe, as do many other observers, that a government bailout for journalism is absolutely imperative. Chicago media reform organization Free Press has issued a proposal calling for a $5 billion bailout to sustain the news industry through the crisis. And in the interest of full disclosure, I will say that I am a member of Free Press. I have donated money to the organization in the past, and I have spoken at Free Press sponsored conferences, so I'm not a completely disinterested party here. But I do think Free Press's proposal is worth considering. Among other things, Free Press is asking for a doubling of federal funds for public media. That's going to principally, public radio and PBS, public TV, which, if we went by current numbers, that would amount to an additional $390 million for public media. They're asking for $2 billion in direct support to fund jobs in commercial newsrooms that produce local journalism. Much of it would come in the form of what they're calling an emergency jobs for journalism tax credit for newsroom employees, which means that the news organizations, the commercial news outlets, whether they're broadcast outlets or newspapers, would get a tax credit for keeping newsroom employees on the payroll. And they're also calling for a funding for a new local civic information, for various new local civic information initiatives that would be distributed in the form of grants, and would prioritize news deserts. And the way they've conceived this is these grants would be administered by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but they wouldn't simply subsidize video or audio journalism. It would be subsidies for all forms of journalism, whether it's online, in print, or in broadcast form. If you'd like to learn more about Free Press's proposal, I would encourage you to visit their website, www.freepress.net, for more information. So those are just some of the ways that we might respond to this crisis, but I hope that this presentation at very least has impressed on you the need for some sort of action to save local journalism in the midst of this pandemic. Thank you.